Why can't I see me now? No, I think it may be on with the other on the phone instead. Hang on. Oh, good. Perfect. All right. Good evening and welcome to the second year of Knowledge Unleashed. My name is Hugh Gordon, for those of you who don't know me, and I teach University Arts and Sciences here at Northern Lights College. And tonight it is my pleasure to bring you Kilroy Was Here, World War II Culture. And so tonight the program is going to be, I'm going to show you a little bit of different cultural artifacts from the Second World War, and then talk about how we remember that culture and how we uh, even, add to it to this day. So first of all, I'd like to give a disclaimer and a trigger warning. There will be some um, images that are racially insensitive, and they are part of the cultural artifacts. They do not represent my views or the views of the college. I just wish to make that clear. I will also be using some obscene language, so warning to the parents in the audience. Okay, so let's begin. So I'm going to make a sound. Does anybody in the audience know what this is? Mhm. Well, maybe that's what it is now. But it's an airborne cricket. This was handed out to Allied airborne soldiers when they landed in Normandy to try to communicate with each other rather than yelling out at each other so that the Germans might hear. This was famously shown in the movie The Longest Day, with John Wayne demonstrating it to his soldiers. The only problem was, is as it showed in the movie, it also sometimes sounded like a German rifle being locked and loaded. So that did not help some of the soldiers. But this is one example, and was made on the original tools and dies in England that made the ones for the airborne. They sell them as souvenirs now. And this is just an example of the pieces of culture that come out of the Second World War. And I'm going to have a few demonstrations as we go on. So I apologize for the font. I tried to find some way of making these questions visible with the background pictures. I tried to pick some iconic pictures from the war, Iwo Jima, the fall of France, Normandy, and the capture of the Reichstag in Berlin. So I could have limited this topic to all sorts of things or a certain aspect of it. I could have just limited it to the portrayal of Nazis in film, maybe next year. But the idea is that I want you to think about, what do you know about the Second World War? Where do you get this knowledge from? Does it come from personal experience, if you're old enough to remember the war? Does it come from your parents who might have lived through it, your grandparents? Does it come from media, such as movies, radio, television, video games, novels? And so that's where we're going to go through a lot of that stuff later on this evening. So we don't just get um, our culture from the war and the event itself, but this culture is added to as you go through, and you go as you go through in the years afterwards. So we'll see that we keep adding to this culture as time goes on. And this lecture is a bit of a catalog of all the different types of culture. Sometimes it doesn't seem like it sticks together. A lot of it is just things that I thought you folks would find interesting, so don't mind me. So to start off, we're going to talk about culture during the war itself, but maybe a little bit before, afterwards. So what is culture? And this is something I'm not going to give you an easy definition because it's something that will mean something different to everybody else. One example is culture is the practices we do together as a group. And so culture can be art, it can be things we do, things we remember. Um, And I could go on trying to describe what Canadian culture is, but then, as somebody says, we don't actually have one, but that's another story, and that's a joke. Um, but we treat culture as so-called high culture entertainment like opera and symphony, art that has particularly cultural value. But then um, there's also low culture or popular culture, which is more of my interest. What does everybody else, what do they take part in while the snobs are trying to basically tell you that certain things are culture and other things are not? But there is a mixture, as you'll see as well. There's propaganda, and propaganda is trying to tell you something or make you do something. For example, here in the college, you'll see propaganda posters. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? For example, there are posters reminding people that, taking someone out for a drink is not yes. That's propaganda. The problem is that propaganda, as we understand it, has been affected by the Second World War and the fascist regimes in it. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we have to understand is that the war that we're talking about, the event that we're talking about that is the basis for all this culture, is a total war. Now, that is something that comes from partly a Joseph Goebbels speech to the Germans during the war. But the idea is a total war was where everybody was involved. Even though there was a home front and a fighting front, people on the home front were expected to do their bit, whether this was in Canada, with the United States, Britain, or Germany, or the Soviet Union. The idea was everybody had to take part because it was a war of a total war, as it were. But as you'll see as well, even though this war is and can be portrayed by propaganda as something that everybody in the nation has to do together, it's something where everybody has to take part, it's uplifting at times or meant to terrify people, it can also be very, very taboo. Soldiers are ordinary people, and they're not all officers and a gentleman. Sometimes they're farmers' sons, sometimes they're workers, sometimes they're people who had been homeless before the war. And they swear like sailors. That's one of the reasons why, we have that phrase is because not from this war itself, but basically military personnel swear because they get sweared at a lot by their sergeants and their officers. Um, as Paul Fussell, a veteran and a historian, basically said, anywhere you go, you're getting sweared at by your officers just to get things done. The F word and S word are added to practically everything you say. And we're going to talk about that as well. But also, alcohol is a big part of the culture of the Second World War, though I haven't focused on it too much, and I will mention it a couple times. But alcohol is one of those things that soldiers used to forget, to deaden the pain. Whereas we talk in other wars like Vietnam about drug culture there, here the culture is predominantly alcohol. However, there is a whole field of study about Germans giving their soldiers amphetamines. And so such things like that is important, but that is something that is still being revealed as well. So who was Kilroy? Now, Kilroy is generally a, um, a graffiti, a piece of graffiti found on ships, walls, anywhere soldiers, sailors, and airmen went, they painted him. And so you saw on one of the posters for this tonight, you have Kilroy poking his nose on a bomber. This is on the National World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. And you see it also in films and in books. Kilroy, we don't actually know who it actually was. We suspect he was actually a shipyard inspector who had his name and put it on the ships that he inspected. The Americans made hundreds and thousands of ships for the war effort. The British had a similar person, Mr. Chad. Sometimes it comes from a Greek omega symbol. Then there's also the Australians graffiti foo, as in foo was here. So with all these Allied soldiers mixing together and wherever they went, Kilroy spread far and wide. And sometimes the Germans are usually portrayed as saying, "Who the heck is that? We got to figure out who he is. It's obviously a dangerous person." My personal favorite is that it's shown at the ending of the iconic World War II comedy, Kelly's Heroes, where it's left for an officer who is not liked by his soldiers after they've stolen a whole bunch of German gold. So, propaganda before the Second World War is stuff that we still remember. It's part of the culture of the other war as well. Um, Very famously, the most famous ones are the propaganda posters recruiting soldiers into the US and British armies, though the British Army one, I believe, of course, went first because the British were in the army before the Americans. But the very famous one, the I Want You for the US Army, showing the traditional mythical Uncle Sam. Um, but so the First World War used propaganda to scare people about the enemy, lie about the enemy, get soldiers to join the armed forces and to fight. And after the war, propaganda still was not as negative as we view it today, partly because film was still in its infancy. Radio had not yet turned into voice transmission until really after the war. So in the 1930s, when the Nazis gained power in Germany, one of the first things Hitler did was to appoint his loyal subordinate, Joseph Goebbels, as Minister for Propaganda and Enlightenment. Look at that phrase, propaganda and enlightenment. It's a positive view of it. Yes, in a very negative regime, but the idea is that it's a good thing to spread this information. So in the Soviet Union, the Soviets, as they were rewriting Russian society, they were trying to create new generations of communist loyal workers. So they tried to show workers how wonderful and utopian and beautiful this socialist utopia was going to be. So they had a whole series of novels, movies, and other pieces of entertainment that was considered socialist realism. And this was trying to show how wonderful it was to be a collective farmer or a worker in a factory. And so one of the stories, or one of the favorite tropes of these heavily censored authors who had to have permission from, Stalin and his friends, was one of the favorite tropes was boy loves girl, girl loves tractor. That, instead of the boy getting the girl, she's in love with the brand new tractor at the collective farm, just to show how dedicated to her work she was. And of course, in the United States, they did have propaganda as well during the Great Depression, but perhaps the most famous and not necessarily dangerous were Franklin Delano Roosevelt's fireside chats from the White House, where he spoke theoretically in front of a fireside, telling his people, everything was going to be okay, that the government was trying to do their best to deal with the horrific situation in the Great Depression. So these are the kinds of things you see before the war. But one of my favorites, then we're going to switch now to talk about propaganda that soldiers see while they're fighting. And one of my favorites is a speech that is given by Dwight D. Eisenhower, commander of the Allied forces, upon the invasion of Normandy. I'm going to play a little bit of it to you here, and I have to see here. And of course, it's not playing because I didn't tell teams to broadcast the sound. So I'll just basically give you the first sentence. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark on the Great Crusade. This is a very inspirational, very supposedly uplifting speech that Eisenhower gave to his troops over the radio before they were landing in Normandy. The reason for this, of course, was that, to try to get the soldiers pumped for finally, they were trying to take the fight directly to Hitler. And so this speech is remembered fairly well. You can see it on YouTube, you see it online. I found dozens of copies of this in military files in the National Archives. But how did the soldiers actually accept it? In a movie called The Americanization of Emily, written by Paddy Chayefsky, a satirist, he basically shows soldiers going, ah, can it, when they kept hearing this speech because they know they might die. They don't necessarily want to hear, uh, something about how wonderful their death is. Uh, but true fact as well, Eisenhower also planned another speech in case the soldiers landed and failed. Unfortunately, that's one of those. I have a book of speeches that were never given that might have, and so that's one of those things, pieces of propaganda that we fortunately remember well, because otherwise it could have turned out very differently. So there's also other propaganda that soldiers faced on the battlefield. In 1945, uh, soldiers from Britain, Canada, the US, and the Soviet Union entered, invaded, and occupied Germany. Part of this campaign, the Western Allies had what was called a non-fraternization policy. Allied soldiers were not supposed to talk, give gifts, and be nice to German civilians to teach them that, basically they had to learn their lesson not to be evil. So that if Allied soldiers were not supposed to talk to them, they weren't supposed to have sex with them either. And so the idea is that you have to basically stay apart from the Germans because they got to learn their lesson. The policy lasted for about 3 months. But the Allies had propaganda to basically tell Germans not to fraternize. And I found these in the British National Archives that were supposed to be given on the BBC. A pretty girl is like a melody, but a pretty German girl's melody is the death march for you. She hates you, just like her brother who speaks her thoughts, just like her brother who fights you, just like Hitler who speaks her thoughts to the world. Don't fraternize. And they all end with the phrase, don't fraternize. It is very blunt propaganda. But there was also propaganda on the home front. And here we see an example that we think is very common, that, it's very famous. Keep calm and carry on. One problem, it wasn't actually broadcast during the war. It was basically, they found a whole swath of this propaganda in a storage area, and after about 20 years ago, they started publicizing it. But it represents the same kind of slogans that was seen during the war. For example, freedom is in peril, defend it with all your might. So these kinds of uplifting and inspiring messages. The Allies had, of course, Germans had Goebbels' propaganda ministry, but the Allies had their own propaganda ministries, the British Office of War, or the American Office of War Information, and the British Ministry of Information, which of course was George Orwell's model for the Ministry of Truth in 1984. So on the home front, civilians were basically told, this is basically what you have to worry about, what you have to do. And they even made films to try to show, what would happen if the Germans invaded, including one film, Went the Day Well, to basically show what Britain would look like under German occupation during the war. Now it's alternate history because we have all sorts of novels and films talking about such things, but propaganda, did it first because they wanted to make sure the British continued to fight. One of the prominent pieces of propaganda in all the Allied nations was for civilians to give money to their government. Now, of course, governments, raised money via taxes, but there was never enough money for governments to build the bombers and ships that they needed. So one of the ways in the US and Canada were either victory loans or victory bonds. And so, of course, at this time, a government was still a good investment. Even up to my childhood, Canada savings bonds were basically a good investment. And during the war, you would basically put in anywhere from about $35 to $20,000, depending on what program you were choosing, and you would get your money back in a few years or in 15 years. It really depended which one you're talking about. And the governments used these they had to use propaganda to sell these, to basically get people to spend money. And the best example is one called If Day. One day, Winnipeg, Manitoba was invaded by the Nazis. There were planes flying overhead, disguised as German planes. The German army marched into town and took prisoner the premier and the mayor and all sorts of government officials. They took over the newspapers. They took over the high schools. This was all part of a campaign to sell victory bonds. It happened for a day and it ended with a parade through downtown Winnipeg, basically with the soldiers there, to raise people's awareness and, of course, raise their inspiration. It was very successful. They sold millions of dollars worth of victory bonds within a few days because of this, to show people this is what happens if you don't give money. Governments probably need to start, threatening people this way for taxes, I think, but that's just my opinion. So I also have some other propaganda posters here. So, anybody know who this is? That's right. Perhaps one of the most famous propaganda images in history, Rosie the Riveter, is, well, we're not actually sure who she is. There have been two women who basically may have been her, and they finally met at one point, and they said, doesn't really matter. We both basically, are proud to serve as that. But this was a representation that women in the Second World War were going beyond what they had done before. Now, they had worked in factories in the First World War, but after the First World War and during the Great Depression, women had been ushered out of the workforce in the name of patriarchy. And then during the Second World War, women were asked to go back into the factories once again. And they did a heck of a lot of different jobs, from building tanks and airplanes to ferrying them across the Atlantic to serving in the army. So this was, a piece of propaganda meant to inspire women to basically say that they could take part, and they did. The problem is that these the fact is the reality of the way women were treated in the war wasn't as good as the propaganda would tell us. Why? Because women were consistently portrayed in army propaganda as carriers of STIs. They were, men were considered, oh yeah, we need to have sex. But women, no, God, no, women can't have sex outside of marriage. These were things that were constantly portrayed. So if a soldier went out and sexually assaulted a woman, he may or may not get a serious charge. But if a woman basically, charged a man with rape, it really depended on the situation. So this is one of those things where the propaganda doesn't necessarily live up to the reality. Then there's other kinds of propaganda, or at least other kinds of culture in service to the nation. During the war, the city of Leningrad of the Soviet Union, the home of the revolution it was before and is now St. Petersburg, was surrounded by the Allies for 900 days, roughly. So during this time, the Germans would keep shelling the city. The Soviets would try to sneak supplies in, but the hunger and the starvation was incredible, leading to a heck of a lot of cannibalism, among other things, we think. But one of the people who was in the city, at least at the start of the siege, was the um, composer Dmitry Shostakovich, who was eventually spirited out of the city, where he finished his Seventh Symphony. And then, very famously, while the city was still under siege, the Soviets held a concert of it in the city, and they broadcast it over the radio. Now, normally, this would be a bad thing in war, because the enemy would use your signal to target you with their artillery. The Soviets were absolutely counting on this, and with their large groups of artillery, they did what we call counter battery fire. They fired back at the German artillery. They used this concert as a bait for the artillery. Now, that is the most Soviet thing I've ever heard, honestly. But So then there's a whole bunch of popular music. As you came in, you may have heard a few examples of pop music from the war. People like Vera Lynn, Bing Crosby, the Andrews Sisters. These are the iconic sounds you heard wherever soldiers went, at least on the Allied side. And on the German side, you heard some Allied stuff too, because the German-born singer and actress Marlene Dietrich, who had left for the U.S. Before Hitler had come to power, she acted as part of the American Office for Strategic Services. That's the forerunner of the CIA. They basically used her and other singers to send songs to Germany to act as to break their morale. So music could be used as propaganda. Even a song like Lili Marlene, which was a German song, but so you actually had both Allied and German soldiers all listening to these songs. I'm not even mentioning the radio people on the Axis side who, spoke to the Allied soldiers in their languages and tried to break their morale, such as Lord Haha, Axis Sally, and Tokyo Rose. And so sometimes these voices from the enemy in their own language, could break your morale, but also was something that you listened to just because it was something good to listen to. Because war can be boring. Films were all part of this propaganda as well, though sometimes they could be really good too. Um, One of the more shameful things about Hollywood in the 30s is that they downplayed the threat of Nazism, even though most of the Hollywood studio owners and producers were many who were Jewish, but they didn't want a backlash against Jews, so they downplayed the threat of the Nazis. But then around when the war starts to break out in 1940, then you start to see some changes. For example, you saw the Three Stooges give their famous Nazi parody, "You Nazi Spy," basically showing that one of the Stooges is made a dictator, pretty much like Hitler. And so the idea is that the rich and wealthy militarists are basically trying to lead him on, but of course the Stooges, humiliate them, as they do. Then there's Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, one of his few films where he actually speaks. So instead, it's a similar story where he's basically an ordinary guy pushed to become a dictator. And at the end of the film, in a very inspiring speech, he denounces fascism and Nazism at a time, and they were even afraid whether they would actually be able to show it in the theater. This is before the US is in the war. But then we get some of the actual wartime propaganda. For example, Casablanca. Probably, and I know I have some friends who say this is the best American movie ever made, and there is a case to be made about it. Other people claim it's Citizen Kane, but Casablanca is a much easier thing to watch. It is, except for the ending, though, it can be very depressing, especially if you like romance stories. But it's one of those stirring things that is a piece of propaganda because it's trying to get Americans to realize that by staying neutral, they had basically endangered themselves and their friends and people they should care about. It's basically an analogy for neutrality and the dangers of it. It shows your typical evil Nazi police. It shows neutral, somewhat cowardly for a little while Vichy police, and the valiant American who finally decides to get in the fight at the end of the movie. But then there's also actual propaganda where the Americans, had to tell their people literally why we fight. So the Americans got famous American director Frank Capra, known for very inspirational movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and he made a series of films for the Army to basically teach Americans this is why we're in the war, to give them the history. It's propaganda. It's a bit more educational, but it also has a particular um, uh, bent to it. So, of course, the Allies were not the only ones who had propaganda. Nazi propaganda is well known. It can also be very highly technically advanced for its time. The Germans, of course, they used color film at sometimes, but perhaps one of the most famous pieces of Nazi propaganda is from before the war. The Triumph of the Will shows one of the early Hitler rallies at Nuremberg. It is basically a fairy tale with Hitler dropping from the sky to go harangue his people. It's just trying to show the broad future for Nazism. But there's also, of course, the very base and horrific German propaganda about Jews as well. The thing is, though, is that the Allies had very racist propaganda as well. How many of you have read Dr. Seuss books as a kid? Hmm? Dr. Seuss started off as a political cartoonist during the Second World War, among other things. And so before the war begins, he lambastes Americans for staying out of the war, basically saying, why are you not fighting? He consistently shows Americans as ostriches with their heads in the sand. But then when the war breaks out, he portrays, the Germans and the Nazis. Look at the way he portrays Hitler versus the way he portrays Hideki Chojo. He portrays the Japanese in a particularly awful light, as you can see. Disney and Warner Brothers did this in cartoons as well. That's a slide from The Ductators. There's another one called Der Fuhrer's Face with Donald Duck. These are children's cartoons, but of course, everybody watched cartoons. They were part of the shows in the movie theaters as well at the same time, depending on what show you went to. But in my research, I studied at least one film called Your Job in Germany, basically showing what Allied soldiers, were going to expect in Germany and how they should not fraternize with German civilians. Some of the Allied propaganda is basically paints the Germans as just as racially as the Germans painted the Jews. Basically saying that every German was a Nazi, that every German was trying to kill them. And so it really depends on the situation. But this is part of the culture, even though it is very base propaganda. And we still see things like this today. So we're going to switch gears here and get away from propaganda, and we're going to talk about food for a bit. This is a World War II poem. Now Jackson had his acorns, and Grant his precious rye. Teddy had his poison beef, worse you couldn't buy. The doughboy had his hardtack without the Navy's jam, but armies on their stomachs move, and this one moves on Spam. Anonymous World War II poem. So, what do people eat during war? I think this is culture. Some people may disagree with me, but it's part of what we do, right? So, and it's a bit of a mix because on the one hand, you learn, propaganda is used to tell people what to eat and what not to eat, how to stretch their diet, but also the food itself is fascinating, at least in my opinion. So, food eaten by soldiers depends on when and where you are, but it can be really bad. The American soldiers had a particular loathing for shit on a shingle, as it was called, creamed chipped beef on toast. Basically, it's jerky that is rehydrated with cream and put on toast. American soldiers have a particular memory for it. Now, the idea was is that if you were an American soldier and you were stateside in a regular army base, you would get all fresh food and good food at your barracks. If you were overseas, away from an area that had fresh food, you'd get, maybe at least hot cooked meals, but you'd get it that was all with prepackaged or preserved stuff. So that because you didn't have access to fresh food. But then if you're on the march, then you get either C rations or K rations. C rations does not really mean concentrated, but it's all basically in cans. And how did you actually open all these cans while you were on the march? Used one of these. This is a P38 can opener, also known as a John Wayne. Why is it called a John Wayne? Because it's as versatile as John Wayne was as an actor. Though I don't quite understand that because John Wayne really had one character. And I've tried this. I bought these again for like $2 on Amazon. And the reason why they claim that it's a P38, it has the same number as a fighter plane, but also it supposedly takes 38 punches to get around one of the cans. There's also its larger brother, a P-51, which is also another name of a fighter plane, excuse me, not a jet. So soldiers would basically eat these rations when they were on the move. And there's a mixture of jam and canned goods, canned butter, canned cheese, gum, cigarettes, all sorts of stuff they would have on these, anything they needed to try to keep going. But one of my favorite things to talk about is the D ration. The D ration is an emergency ration to be eaten only in an emergency. So the American government went to Hershey's and said, make us a chocolate bar that tastes a little better than a boiled potato. So it's got sugar in it. It's got chocolate in it, but it tastes apparently like death. So the D ration was supposed to only be eaten in an emergency. And it was basically, they made a whole bunch of it so it wouldn't melt. There's also some what they call tropical chocolate as well. And so the D bar was something that probably was not eaten by many because it was not pleasant. But the idea was that they were worried that soldiers would basically eat them when they weren't supposed to, and then they would not have food when they needed emergency rations in a lifeboat or in the middle of a desert or something like that. But food is one of those things that was universal, partly because the Americans had such good logistics. The Americans were known for manufacturing before the war, and during the war, they spread their culture, their food, around the world wherever their soldiers went. Very famously, President of Coca-Cola, Robert Woodruff, made a promise saying every man in uniform gets a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents wherever he is and whatever it costs the company. And to send these Coke bottles around the world, they had what were called Coke colonels. Basically, observers who were not soldiers in army fatigues who had sometimes army transports to send Coke all around the world wherever soldiers went. You may have seen online, there is a picture that claims to be a Frenchman's first time drinking Coca-Cola with a very disgusted look on his face. You know, there's always this is where we get the stereotypes that Europeans hate American culture. One of the reasons for this is that during the war, Europeans did not have their own stuff. They ran out of food, partly because of what the Germans did, because food was given to soldiers. So part of the problem is that the Americans, who, as the British famously said, were overpaid, oversexed, and over here, the Americans had all sorts of goods like Hershey bars. Here. And so Hershey bars, of course, which the Europeans claimed was not as good as a European chocolate, but it was available. But the thing is, this became something that Allied soldiers gave to others. And so they traded with these goods to the Europeans. So the Europeans got a hankering for American-style chocolate, for Coca-Cola, for nylons. So, and the problem is that the Allies, of course, had all these goods, and the local women wanted them, and so they made friends with the local women, which of course angered the local men or the local soldiers when they came home. And it caused problems in places like Holland in particular, where Canadian soldiers were blamed by the Dutch, and they got into some riots. That was part of my dissertation. So one of the things that was also part of this war was alcohol. Soldiers craved it. As I said, it was the major drug, at least for the Allies. And so some soldiers would get a belt before they went into battle because, to give them some so-called Dutch courage. But also, one of the more nastier aspects is during the occupation of Germany, in what has been referred to sometimes as victory dances, and this happens in some other wars, Allied soldiers would go into German homes and they would demand alcohol. And they would drink with the people inside. And then sometimes they would ask for a woman and take her into the back room and rape her. The Canadian Army, there were a number of cases that have been recorded. They were court-martialed. At least the court-martialed cases were recorded. We don't know how many were not recorded. But alcohol, at least, is I won't say it's the trigger or the instigator, but it's part of this pattern. They go in looking for alcohol. Are they looking for alcohol or are they looking for sex? So anyways, I'd be happy to talk about that later if anybody's interested. So, but part of what Allied soldiers received, particularly if you were in a POW camp, were parcels from the Red Cross. Red Cross parcels became like almost iconic because they had everything of home that soldiers and prisoners could not get. And the Canadian Red Cross made 40,000 parcels a week at one point and sent 16 million overseas to POWs and soldiers. And so in these things, hang on a second here. No, okay. So in these parcels, you would have biscuits, butter, cheese, chocolate, tinned meat, jam, powdered milk, prunes, raisins, sardines, salmon, salt and pepper, sugar, soap, cigarettes, and of course, spam. I'll talk about spam in a few more minutes. But here you see this is a Canadian picture, so you'll see on it click or clim, cam. You'll see Nielsen's Jersey milk chocolate. So these are things, and I think that's the standard Hereford corned beef that we see on the shelves as well too. So these are all things that Canadian soldiers, you don't get it when especially if you're in a German POW camp. So these things are like gold. Okay. And we're going to talk about volunteering in a bit too. But food is one of those things that becomes part of the home front as well. Even though in North America, we didn't really have a possibility of running out of food, but food was rationed here in North America simply because to be able to make sure it got sent where it needed overseas. But the idea was it had to be rationed because you had to gear up and send enough food to feed the soldiers, but also to feed your friends overseas. So part of the problem is that some of the farm workers and the workers in the factories had joined the army. So you had to, preserve some of that food for yourselves at home, but also send it overseas. And one of the solutions were so-called victory gardens, encouraging people to grow their own vegetables so that they would have food at home instead of, taking food out of the mouths of soldiers. Though to be fair, fruits and vegetables were never really rationed because there were enough of them. That wasn't the problem. The stuff you had to ration, and I'll get to that in a second, is more like meat and edible fats for reasons we'll discuss in a second. So one of the home front myths about food is that carrots are good for your eyes. Where does this come from? During the Second World War, the British had a magical new weapon, radar. And it, told the Allies where German planes were when they're coming to Britain to bomb Britain. And of course, the British wanted to hide this secret. So when the Germans are starting to wonder, how do they see our planes? The British basically said, we eat more carrots, that's why. So rationing was a part of the home front wherever you were. Whether you were in the Soviet Union, whether you were in Canada, the United States, or Germany, or Britain. Um, but the idea was is that food would be rationed, but also strategic materials such as rubber, because there's no rubber trees in North America, and you got most of it from Asia. Even though Henry Ford at one point tried to make rubber in South America, where rubber originally came from, he failed. So food, rubber, and other things were, and gas in particular, of course, were rationed. You had ration books there. And the idea was is that you had to make sure that people weren't hoarding. So the Americans had the Office of Price Administration to distribute their ration books. And you had what were called red books and blue books. Red was for processed foods that you get in canned, and blue points were for meat and fats. Why fats? Does anybody know why fat was rationed? Because you could use it in explosives. So then, of course, we have the iconic World War II meat, Spam. You can see the look of disgust on my wife's face. Literally called originally spiced ham from Hormel in 1937. It's a pre-war product. But because Allied forces needed to, ramp up, food supply and share it around the world, Spam became essentially food for soldiers, for civilians. It is now very popular, for example, in Pacific Islands, where the Allies liberated at one point as well. So this is one of those things where we treat it as um, bad food. It's high in, it literally says on it that it has sugar and salt and all sorts of things that we think are bad now. But back then, of course, this was essential for caloric intakes during the war. Volunteering was a major aspect of fighting the war. For example, the Red Cross had their donut dollies. They're girls who would go overseas and serve in club mobiles, basically army trucks outfitted to serve coffee and donuts to soldiers. And all sorts of groups would basically um, go out and um, uh, serve food for soldiers. They would give knitted goods to soldiers. They would so-called adopt ships. Some Canadian vessels were named after towns. So people in that town would donate goods and supplies to the sailors overseas. It was a way of connecting people to the war effort as well. Okay, so we're going to move on a little bit here, a little short section talking about language and material culture of total war. A lot of the language we get from the war remains with us. Things like bazooka, which comes from other things, but is a World War II weapon. And some items that are iconic are also still with us that we identify as part of the Second World War. The vocabulary is random. A lot of it is military terms and soldier slang. It's weapons. I mean, a mulberry, for example, here, just to give one example, is um, a mulberry is a artificial harbor the Allies used in Normandy to land supplies. A Tiger is a German tank. Sonar is a weapon to detect submarines. And a few of these I'll go on later. Does anybody know what a short arm inspection is? Do you want to share it with us? You don't have to. hmm Yes, exactly. Yeah. They would line soldiers up and to check them out. Yes. All right. And this is the promised swearing. Um, certain phrases were very common in the war. Chicken shit basically meant this insanity, this BS that, this army bureaucracy, everything stupid that people were forced to do. Motherfucker, of course, came out of the African American tradition. Uh, the F word came from previously, but it was the African Americans who taught it to the other Americans during the war. And it is still a very powerful weapon. My mother would hate me for saying this. But soldiers swearing, as I mentioned earlier, was constant. It was a coping mechanism for the insanity. The so-called V for victory sign that Winston Churchill is famous for using is actually a It's an obscene gesture on the part of the British. You'll see them do it in movies and stuff like that. Churchill, of course, was oblivious. But that certainly fits like Churchill. But my favorites are the Army acronyms that you get that are used by soldiers to the present day. FUBAR, fucked up beyond all relief. Basically, this situation is just crazy. Or SNAFU, situation normal, all fucked up. Basically, this is standard Army practice. It just nothing ever works, nothing ever gets along. These are all things that soldiers said on a regular basis, especially American ones. But Canadians would, of course, grasp onto this as well. And we see a lot of course, symbols that are immediately familiar to us. You have the hammer and sickle of the Soviet Union, which, of course, was famous beforehand. But, of course, the Red Star and the hammer and sickle, they were now allies. Nazi symbols, of course, have taken on a particularly sinister meaning as icons of hate, the flashes of the SS and the swastika. Then you get more heroic ones like the RAF roundel. I could have put the RCAF roundel with the maple leaf in it, the roundel of the US Army Air Force on the rising sun of the Japanese Empire, or of course, that is another example of Nazi tyranny, the yellow star given to Jews in ghettos and in concentration and death camps. But finally, the one on the right. Does anybody know what the one on the far right is on the bottom? That's I'm going to mispronounce it because I cannot, rouler mes airs, the Croix de Lorraine, the symbol of the Free French resistance and the Free French Army. So the written word, of course, is part of the culture. And I'll talk about novels and stuff later, but soldiers, of course, sent letters to home. And so how did the military do this? The soldiers would write it on a standard piece of paper. They would microfilm it, and then they would send it across the ocean and then print it and then send it again. So imagine how many letters you can send on a standard roll of microfilm versus a big bag of mail. So this was what was called V-mail. But of course, every letter that soldiers sent home was censored because they didn't want the soldiers telling where everything was. So what the soldiers did, or what the Army did, was they recorded what the soldiers were saying in reports, especially if it was of any interest to the Army. So of course, if the soldiers, knew where they were, it would be recorded. But also, if soldiers, for example, didn't like the food, or if they didn't like the civilians they met, or if they had all sorts of griefs, the Canadian Army recorded these and put these in reports. They are a fascinating resource, my favorite one from the war, because it gives us a snapshot of what soldiers were thinking in a given week. And sometimes you hear of them looting. Sometimes you hear about them, complaining about their officers, complaining about the food, but it's anonymous. So we're not breaking any privacy because we don't know who's saying it, but it's a way of getting just a small glimpse into what people were thinking during the war. But also we have physical objects like the cricket and the P-38 or P-51. These are little things from the war that mean things to people who live through it, or if you've seen culture after the war, you'll hear it as well. For example, air raid sirens from, for example, the Blitz. If you hear an air raid siren, I won't play it for you, it'll scare the heck out of me. And they mean something to me because in the Cold War, the air raid siren meant, an oncoming nuclear attack, whereas at least during the Second World War, it was just a German attack. And of course, the Germans had their own air sirens for when the Allies were bombing them. But one of the more fascinating ones I've come across are victory verticals. I think it was Steinway who produced pianos to be airdropped for soldiers carried on bombers and sent overseas so that soldiers would have some music to play. Most armies would basically give soldiers harmonicas. But this is an example of American manufacturing prowess. But for example, we can't talk about material culture in the war without the weapons. This is a war after all. Some of the weapons that you see on here are pre-war. In fact, most of them are. The M1911 pistol that the Americans developed before the First World War, or the Thompson submachine gun, which is actually more famous from earlier in the 1920s and 30s, Al Capone, anyone. So, but the only difference is that whereas the Tommy gun that is usually used by gangsters has a round drum magazine, the one used by soldiers has a tubular magazine. So that's usually how you can tell the difference. So sometimes you might see soldiers with a drum magazine, but not often. The German Schmeisser, that's usually called, but it's actually a MP38 or MP40 machine pistol that was later replaced by an MP44, which looks very much like the Soviet AK-47. Then you have other guns like the M1 Garand. Now, for most people, you wouldn't know an M1 unless you were involved with World War II culture. And one of the reasons why my generation knows it is because it makes a particular sound when you eject the magazine. It goes ping. And for those of you who play World War II video games, it'll be very familiar. Oh, sorry. And one more thing, of course, the picture in the background is of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If there's one weapon that dominated culture for the next 50 years and to this day, it is the atomic bomb. And the threat it hangs over all of us to this day. World War III is still a possibility, folks. So, military vehicles are also one of those things that we get from the war that we still use to this day to somewhat. Any of you drive a Jeep? Nope. Okay, that's fine. Jeeps are basically from the Second World War. The so-called Willys Jeep is one example, but basically the Army came out with a need for a quarter-ton truck. And the Jeep emerged from that. The Jeep is one of those vehicles that was incredibly versatile, and it was used by the American military until the 1980s when it was replaced by the Humvee. And I still don't understand why they replaced it with the Humvee. Probably because it theoretically is more defensible. But the Jeep, you could run it over anywhere. You could add an artillery piece on the back of it. You could, add a turret onto it. It could go over anything, and you could repair it relatively easily. And of course, in MASH in Korea, Radar O'Reilly tried, or no, that was Klinger tried to eat it. Radar tried to send one home. So, but there's other weapons of the war that we, if you see a picture, you'll recognize it. The Sherman tank, the B-17 or the B-29, a German U-boat. Other ones like the C-47 or Dakota or the DC-3 transport plane. Other bombers like the Lancaster, the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero that you see in films. All these things will scream out World War II to you. The Sherman tank in particular, I think, but yeah. But even fashion, of course, the war affected things like fashion. For example, the Ike jacket, the short military jacket worn by Dwight Eisenhower. Nazi uniforms, of course, are iconic in a horrific way. For example, they're not actually designed by Hugo Boss when I read, but they were made by Hugo Boss. Similar distinctions, small distinction, but still valid. Yeah. Coco Chanel was a Nazi spy. Think about that the next time you either wear a Chanel jacket or Chanel No. 5. But basically, clothes and accessories, were part of the war. I mean, even before the war, British civilians were issued gas masks out of fear that the Nazis were going to basically drop gas bombs on London. But perhaps the biggest lesson about fashion during the war is about making do. People on the home front needed to make sure they didn't run out of anything. This is from a book called Saints, Sinners, and Soldiers, which is a wartime prices and trade board um, uh, poster in Canada with a very elfin-like fellow there, if you can see his pointed ears. I'm not sure why. But it says, eat it up, wear it out, make it do, take care of what you have. It's like our 3 Rs: reduce, reuse, and recycle. It's basically the same thing. Okay, so now in the last section here, we're going to be talking about the culture that emerged from the war. The movies, the video games, the television series, and the type of things we remember from the war that are not from the war itself. So, how do we learn about the past? What do we learn about the past? How do we learn about it? How do we hear about it? How has it changed over time? So, for example, the Second World War is remembered as the good war. Why? Because we won. The Americans, of course, got into several wars afterwards: Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and they didn't win. And so the Second World War, for particularly in American culture, is usually painted as something, as a good thing, because they fought for the right reasons, they won, they didn't really commit too many war crimes, depending on who you talk to. So this is one of those things that we remember it this way. Of course, this is how we remember it in North America. How the Germans remember it is a different story. We taught them that they did wrong, and so they remember this war in a whole different light. Nazi symbols are not allowed to be shown in Germany because they have taken to heart, for the most part, that what they did was wrong. The Soviets, of course, remember the war as the Great Patriotic War, the war where they defeated the fascist tyranny in the name of Stalinist tyranny. And so the Soviets and now the Russians, they use this war as a symbol of when things were good for the Soviet Union, even though 20 million people died in it. To this day, Russians still have films that are propaganda showing how wonderful the Soviet Union was. For example, there are 2 films about the T-34 tank. One my wife and I watched called Tanks to Stalin, that is actually a pre-war, which shows a bunch of Germans infiltrating the Soviet Union to try to destroy the prototype. And another one called just T-34, I believe is about, and I haven't seen it, is about a group of Soviet soldiers basically, fending off the enemy with their tank. The Russians still make what we would call propaganda, and it's still very easy to see as propaganda. The thing is that most propaganda you see from after the war can be very subtle. For example, the very popular Time Life history books of the Second World War leave out a lot of the bad stuff, a lot of the negative stuff. It's not a very balanced picture, according to one historian that I've read. In fact, the way we look at the war has been basically shaped by people who did not really live through it, but we've painted the people in the war as perfect, practically. The American journalist Tom Brokaw called the Second World War generation the greatest generation. I hate this, because it's the assumption that one generation is better because they stood up. Even though if you read Brokaw's actual words about the other American journalist, Andy Rooney from 60 Minutes, he said, the character of the current generation is just as strong. It's just that his generation had a depression, World War II, and a Cold War against which to test their character. There's a lot of memes these days about, at least back during the pandemic. One of the ones that I enjoyed is that, this guy's generation went out and fought a war. Meanwhile, all you have to do is sit inside your house for a month during lockdown. The assumption is that this generation doesn't have what it takes. I think that's BS, because if it's necessary, look at the people fighting in Ukraine and elsewhere, people, taking part in defending their homeland. Just because we have cell phones doesn't mean we're weak. It means we may have to learn a few lessons, but that doesn't mean we're weaker. But the thing is that other generations of American soldiers in particular were painted in very poor light. For example, Korean War vets, oh, they were brainwashed by the Chinese communists. In Vietnam, they were a bunch of drugged hippies, who didn't get the war done, and they basically, were faced shell shock, battle fatigue, operational exhaustion, PTSD, and of course, they got spat on by Jane Fonda. Then there's the Persian Gulf War vets, the Nintendo pilots. They just use joysticks to win wars. It's even more so now. But a lot of those soldiers came back from the Persian Gulf with Gulf War syndrome. They were exposed to something and the army didn't recognize it for years. And then the soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan have been painted as racists who, Abu Ghraib and other elements where they mistreated local Muslims, or they basically were just treated any of the locals as basically less than human. A lot of this stuff all happened in the Second World War, folks. We just don't talk about it. So novels were one way that veterans and other people wrote about basically shared their views of the war. And some of these stories were traditional war novels that basically showed heroics, and they're basically pulp fiction. But the other great novels really showed the war in different ways. Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five is not quite an autobiography, but I haven't read all of it, but it shows him or his stand-in character, Billy Pilgrim, in Dresden during the Allied bombing and the horrific aspect of that war. Joseph Heller's Catch-22 is probably one of my favorite novels. It shows the insanity of being an Allied bomber crewman. The movie in 1970 with Alan Arkin is very dreamlike, but also horrific. It shows just the insanity of the officers who fought the war, and that when you're the one person who basically is not crazy, everybody else sees you as crazy. That's my interpretation of it, at least. Herman Wouk wrote an early war novel, The Caine Mutiny, about a destroyer in the Pacific where the captain probably suffered from PTSD and was a little tyrannical, and so his officers remove him and are put on trial. Humphrey Bogart gives an A-plus performance in this movie as the demented Captain Queeg. Then later on, Wouk wrote a couple of magisterial novels called The Winds of War and War and Remembrance, which were made into miniseries during the height of the miniseries craze in the 1980s. And they are your standard miniseries, overly dramatic, melodramatic, with wall-to-wall stars. And but other novels, one of my favorite movies is the German Das Boot, about a Nazi submarine crew. It was basically first a novel, basically the experiences of a wartime correspondent on one of these submarines, as in the movie. And it humanizes the enemy for a lot of Americans. I remember watching the movie in undergrad, actually. But there's also more popular thriller novels. Ken Follett, along with his historical fiction like The Pillars of the Earth, has produced a long series of war novels about commandos and spies. And he's very good at ratcheting up tension, whether it's The Eye of the Needle, made into a film with Donald Sutherland, or another one called Jackdaws, about a group of female commandos who are tracked by an evil SS officer, or was he an army officer? Doesn't matter. But then there's also Jack Higgins' The Eagle Has Landed, about a plot to kidnap Churchill, made into a movie with Michael Caine and also Donald Sutherland. But then I'm not even into one of my favorite movies yet, but we'll be there in a second. But basically, the movies, um, when the war movies started getting made, they were your traditional war movies. Basically, imagine the standard, they're black and white, heroic. You have maybe a group of soldiers with a sergeant going to fight. Think of Sands of Iwo Jima with John Wayne. Think of Navy movies, Run Silent, Run Deep with, sorry, no, I'm thinking The Enemy Below with Robert Mitchum. Or I think Run Silent, Run Deep is with Clark Gable. That's it. So there's some very traditional war movies. And of course, John Wayne looms over these writ large. To quote the American comedian Bob Newhart, I guess they're all John Wayne war movies. Did you ever think how close we came to losing the war if he wasn't with us? John Wayne, of course, is the essential American hero, even though he didn't actually serve in the military in the war, but that's another story. Jimmy Stewart did. He was a soldier. He was a bomber pilot. Ronald Reagan made films. He didn't really serve, but he wasn't technically in the military. So it's weird the way we remember certain heroes. But a lot of the traditional war movies are your standard heroes win the war. But the other ones, even though I have to admit I haven't really seen many of these, Audie Murphy was the US's most decorated soldier in the war. They turned him into a Hollywood star, basically. So he made movies about himself and other war movies. So these war movies, give the ideas of heroes. What is a hero? So is it somebody who doesn't give up, who goes into battle no matter the odds? So you have all the standard tropes of a war novel. Sometimes the heroes who survive, sometimes the heroes who have a last stand. You have all sorts of different types. So here you have a whole variety of war movies. Most of these are your standard heroic style of war movies. If you see one that you want to know about, I will talk later, but we don't have that much time, so I won't go over all of these. I want to, but I won't. But many of these are your typical stories. I'll give you just like a broad stroke here. The war movies are soldiers go into a battle, they either succeed or they lose, or it's about a particular person like Patton, how either crazy or genius he was, depending on your point of view, or how much of a jerk he was. Then there's the Navy movies where you're either, showing a battle, or you're showing a particular ship, or in the case of the very overrated U-571, basically the Americans capturing a German submarine for the Enigma machine on it. The British did it first. Then there's, of course, Greyhound, which is about, with Tom Hanks, about a convoy duty, an ordinary convoy across the Atlantic. Then there's the air movies, which usually show maybe one plane, one crew, or 12 O'Clock High, which shows a whole squadron. But so there's, most of these films are male, lots of men, very few women, maybe some girlfriends, maybe a few female military officers. There's usually maybe a love interest if you're lucky. They usually don't pass the Bechdel test. So later, movies would get more diverse characters, but and it really depends what you talk about. So the home front on screen is one of those things where, depending on where you are, you might see different versions of what it's like to be a civilian during war. Mrs. Miniver was a movie created in the United States to show the Americans what the British home front was like during the war. So it wasn't really representative because it was made on a Hollywood soundstage. But one of my favorites is Hope and Glory. It's by a British man, John Boorman, who he basically shows his childhood of growing up during the Blitz. As a boy, he grows up around the bombed buildings. But my favorite part is the ending. His grandfather is dropping him off at school. He's really upset. He doesn't want to go back to school, right? He was having so much fun at his father's home in the country. He gets out of the car, turns the corner, and sees all his school chums throwing their book bags up in the air, yelling and screaming. The Nazis have bombed the school. And as one of his friends yells, "Thank you, Adolf," the boy basically goes back, and the last scene is him and his grandfather laughing maniacally as they drive away. But there's another more recent home front film that is very unique. Taika Waititi's Jojo Rabbit. It's a very good movie. It shows a little young boy in the Hitler Youth in Germany. His mother's played by Scarlett Johansson, and he's basically just an ordinary boy with one minor difference. His imaginary friend is Adolf Hitler, played by Taika Waititi, who's New Zealander. So basically, and I believe he's a Pacific Islander or Maori. I can't remember correctly. I could be wrong. If anybody wants to correct me, please do. But so, and this Hitler, of course, isn't real. But the boy basically has to go on living in a horrible time where his mother is eventually hanged as a spy. The Hitler Youth leader basically gives up his life to protect him from the attacks. It's just the insanity of war with a German flavor. But probably one of my favorite group of films. By the way, if I wanted to just talk about World War II films, I could have, and we would be here all weekend. Okay. So commando and spy films are one of those things that became very popular, particularly in the 1960s, because they showed a gallant group of men, mostly men, sometimes women, going and destroying probably a German installation, whether it was the Dirty Dozen or rescuing an American general, as in Where Eagles Dare with Richard Burton and Clint Eastwood, or more interesting ones like 36 Hours, where a Allied officer is captured and meant to think the war is over, so he'll give out the plans to Operation Overlord. Or, as I said, the Eagle has landed, where a plot to capture Churchill. All these things. Now, these came out during the period of the early James Bond movies. Now, of course, Ian Fleming was a World War II intelligence officer. So even though James Bond was named after someone he knew, and of course, sometimes the war effort sounds like a James Bond film, but mostly not. But a lot of these commando films are basically, they're part of the same genre at times. The soldiers fire an infinite amount of weapons, they don't really die, and there's always another explosion. They never get hit. And there's, of course, the dashing spies and revolutionaries fighting, and the arrogant allies, depending on the story. The most recent film of this type was The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. It feels like you're watching a video game, honestly, because they take it about as seriously, and the accuracy is not great. And of course, for a historian, accuracy is important, except when you're watching films that are specifically not taking it seriously. You have TV comedies like Hogan's Heroes, where a lot of the Nazis are played by Jews, among other things. I mentioned the Americanization of Emily, which was an early satire about the war that was very, very black comedy by Paddy Chayefsky. Then there's the Mel Brooks broad comedies, The Producers, or To Be or Not to Be, which of course was based on a Jack Benny movie from many years earlier. But my favorite is Kelly's Heroes. It's a story of a group of ragtag Allied soldiers who are going to steal gold from a bank in France from the Germans, starring Clint Eastwood, Telly Savalas, and very famously Donald Sutherland, who's basically a hippie. In the movie, he basically says things like, "Why don't you knock off with them negative waves?" He sounds like he stepped off of Haight Ashbury in San Francisco, but in 1945, 44. So, but there's other movies where basically people are basically, you see the Vietnam issues where basically the Americans are starting to question what they do in the war, so the soldiers are not portrayed as in the same light. You also see wars where you see the insanity of war, like None But the Brave on a Desert Island with Japanese. But then you get the weird ones. The American comedy 1941 by Steven Spielberg, showing the Americans panicking over a possible Japanese attack on Los Angeles. It is a comedy. It was not well received when it came out, but it's actually, if you like slapstick, it's fantastic. John Belushi plays Wild Bill Kelso, a fighter pilot who claims to have shot down several Japanese soldiers over Bakersfield, no, or at least over middle of California. So, but perhaps the weirdest is, well, actually, no, that's not true. One of the weirdest is a movie that came out in 1980. An American nuclear aircraft carrier goes back in time to the day before Pearl Harbor. It's called The Final Countdown, and the American captain, played by Kirk Douglas, who of course has been in several World War II films, has to figure out, led by an advisor played by Martin Sheen, to figure out, should I attack the Japanese fleet that's about to attack Pearl Harbor? Well, gosh darn it, of course he has to, because it's his job to defend the US in whatever time period. Of course, the time travel incident happens again, and before the USS Nimitz destroys more than a couple of Japanese aircraft, they get sent back to 1980. And it's basically a propaganda film for the US Navy, and it shows real sailors on a real aircraft carrier. But for a military nerd like me, it's a lot of fun, but it's, of course, no basis in reality. But the most surreal World War II film has to be Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Basterds, where he literally paints it as a story, once upon a time, where basically a group of eventually Allied commandos kill Adolf Hitler in a theater. That's the one with Brad Pitt. And Brad Pitt steals the show, other than next to Christoph Waltz, who also steals the show. The two of them have perfect performances in that movie. Waltz plays an incredible Nazi, though I like his character in Django Unchained much better because he's a hero in that one. So, but basically the wars goes on from the heroic to the surreal to what would happen if. There's Holocaust movies like Schindler's List or The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which are, you can only watch once, basically, for a lot of these. Then there's hunting Nazi war criminals, based on the actual story of the capture of Adolf Eichmann by the Israelis in South America. So a lot of novels and movies created, what was this hunt for other Nazi war criminals like, such as The Odessa File by Frederick Forsyth, or Marathon Man by William Goldman, which of course created a whole new generation of people who hated dentists because the Nazi war criminal was a dentist and tortures Dustin Hoffman in the movie. Then a few years ago, there was another one about hunting Nazi war criminals who tried to create a Fourth Reich in a TV series called Hunters with Al Pacino. But then, of course, there's Nazis trying to take over the world again. Another hunt for Nazi war criminals includes The Boys from Brazil, where Gregory Peck plays Josef Mengele, the hideous Nazi war criminal at Auschwitz. And then, of course, there was the Amazon series, The Man in the High Castle. One of my favorites is Iron Sky, which is that in 1945, the Nazis colonized the moon and come back. It's what they call a D movie. It's horrible. It's basically, I think it's so bad it's good, and it knows it's bad. It just basically, it makes fun of everything. But finally, my favorite movie as a kid was one that Disney made called The Last Flight of Noah's Ark. Elliot Gould and Genevieve Bujold fly a bunch of animals and a pair of kids across the Pacific. They get lost, crash on a deserted island in an old B-29, and they meet up with two Japanese soldiers who have been there for 40 years. It's one of the first movies that humanizes an enemy that people can learn to get along. In that way, it's a very traditional Disney movie. And again, but of course, it has a piece of everything. Japanese soldiers, a B-29 flying for me, and of course, an adventure story. And so we're getting close to the end here, folks. And so the last section I want to talk about really is about video games. Because as I was thinking about this lecture, I realized something. For my generation in particular, and maybe the generation under than me, We've seen movies. We didn't fight in a war, but we do play a lot of video games. And during my lifetime, video games have gone from being 2D to 3D and to VR even. One of the first games I played as a kid, first game ever, one of the first games ever, was a game on my Apple IIc called Castle Wolfenstein. You are an Allied soldier escaping from the Nazis. That's the one on the top left there. Very simple. It's also where I learned my first words of German because they keep going around, "Was pass? Heil," and all those other Nazi things. Very horrible sounding early computer sound system. But this wasn't the only game. There was Beyond Castle Wolfenstein, which looked similar. Then in the 1990s, a Doom clone was, or no, sorry, that's not true. It wasn't a Doom clone. It came first. Was Wolfenstein 3D, bottom right, where you went around and shot a gun, which was nobody really had done too much of that before. But over next few years, it got more and more detailed until finally it looks really real as you're wandering around. I can do this in VR now, even if I ever wanted to. The Wolfenstein series has gone into alternate history, the myth of the Nazi and the occults, like in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so the Wolfenstein series is one of those that left reality way far behind, and you're this dashing Allied soldier who even in the series eventually becomes the Nazis win the war and the guy has to keep fighting after he's been injured and in a coma for 20 years. But for many people, World War II games were basically, a lot of shooters. And one of the most, excuse me. One of the most popular video game series in the world is Call of Duty. Now, the very first Call of Duty was a fully 3D game. You're carrying a rifle, and you go between being different types of Allied soldiers, maybe German soldiers, but mostly Allied. And so, or no, I think Call of Duty was all Allied, but if I'm wrong, somebody correct me, please. I can't remember. It's been so long. So, but most famously, the first Call of Duty replicated a movie scene. Enemy of the Gates, Enemy at the Gates, starring Jude Law, was about Stalingrad. And so in the movie, Jude Law is a Soviet soldier thrust into battle without a weapon. The game basically recreates that. You're landing in Stalingrad, you're being bombed by the Germans, you're rushing through the city trying to survive. And the Call of Duty series brought you all around the world. And they brought you to Stalingrad, they brought you to Normandy, they brought you to Italy, they brought you to the Pacific and in Africa. And now, of course, they're fighting mostly in the modern era or maybe even the future. But Call of Duty is very popular, especially as a multiplayer shooter. I'm more of a single player person. The other one that I really like that is Battlefield 1942. It's mostly an online multiplayer thing where you load onto a map of a battlefield and you and the people on your team try to capture the map. And so you're fighting your airplanes or ships or cars or tanks or whatever, and you're fighting it back and forth. And these types of games got me to thinking. My generation knows about the weapons, the vehicles, the sounds of the weapons. They know the maybe a stylized version of the environment, all based on something totally fake. And so maybe some of these games may have some historical advisors, but it's all about entertainment. So the way we remember the war is changing and evolving as we go on, because my generation knows about it the way that my parents never did. Whereas my parents got it from film. We get it from video games as well as some films, though film is not as important anymore. And then there's the strategy games, where you're trying to win the war in a different way. You get a number of troops, or you have to build troops or recruit troops. And all these series of strategy games, whether it's on a global scale, where you have a map of the world and you're trying to win the war, or you're on a very small map of a city and you're trying to knock out a German army, and you're either creating vehicles And again, these are mostly not very factual because literally in some of these games, you make the weapons on the map and you try to attack with the weapons, whereas in reality, the weapons had to cross half the world to get to that battlefield. And what you had was what you had. It depends on the situation. It depends on the game. So finally, and just two more slides here. So in the Second World War, propaganda played an important part to try to convince people to do things they didn't want to do. And we can still see things to this day back in COVID, pretty much, trying to things like stop the spread, or even the signs you see in the bathrooms about how to wash hands. These are all things, similar stuff was shown during the war. But we were basically sacrificing for the national good. And remember, I said the keep calm and carry on one, that's very common these days. Again, it's from the war, but not shown during the war. And so we see, ones that are, make fun of it, stay alive, and avoid zombies. I certainly hope the zombies aren't coming. But World War II culture affects us in so many different ways. For example, meme culture has been, inundated with aspects of the Second World War. Godwin's law basically is that for any online argument, eventually it will, involve Adolf Hitler or involve somebody calling each other a Nazi. And again, he argues that it's not as exactly the way it's usually portrayed, but it's also, somewhat true if you look at everybody calling each other fascist or Nazi or whatever. But one of my favorites is about 15 years ago when the Germans produced a movie called Downfall, basically about Hitler's last days in the bunker, where Hitler is played by German actor Bruno Ganz, who gives a masterful performance of Hitler's insanity and his rage. But at one scene where the German generals are telling him that basically the attack that was supposed to happen didn't because they don't have the soldiers are not attacking, and he flies into a rage and he's ranting for about 5 minutes. Somebody turned this into a meme. How did they do that? They changed the subtitles to any kind of rant you can imagine, whether it's about back then it was Obama, or anything, or this one, as the subtitles here say, I want DMCA takedown notices sent to on all of these videos immediately. That may have been the original one. But basically, this whole idea that, must be the end of the night. But we still call back to like Hitler's insanity. We still call back to German example or World War II examples in our discussion of our modern culture. One final weird thing. So Bruno Ganz in that movie Downfall played Hitler. In another movie, The Boys from Brazil, he played a Austrian scientist who tells Laurence Olivier's Nazi hunter that you could clone anybody. You could clone a whole bunch of Mozarts. And as Laurence Olivier tells him, no, they're not cloning Mozart. They're cloning Adolf Hitler. So the irony is he plays a guy who, tells somebody about cloning Adolf Hitler. Well, later on he plays actually Adolf Hitler. That's one of my weird little synchronicities that I find amusing. But anyway, that is where we end up. Thank you for bearing with me. Here's a few other readings if you'd be interested in learning more about this, but I'll be happy to take your questions now. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Bit of it. I would think that they haven't stopped. It's just been constant. It's not, if you look back, there's so there's never been a time when this World War II stuff wasn't there. So, I mean, there's obviously, yes, at anniversaries, there's always a surge, whether it's D-Day, I mean, um, and of course, Masters of the Air, I mean, it probably came out, what, this year, right? So that is the, yes, yeah, so it is the 80th anniversary of D-Day, yeah. But honestly, if you go back, there's always another anniversary to remember. That's the nice thing about having a war that happened from 1939 to 1945. There's practically a 10th or a 5th anniversary, whatever, 5 or 10 anniversary every year, basically. So to somebody who is immersed in World War II stuff, I don't think there's actually a boom and bust. I think it honestly just keeps continuing. That's my opinion. I could be wrong, but I mean, yeah. Any other questions? All right, then, folks, thank you very much. Thank you for attending. Thank you for sitting through with us, and have a good evening and have a wonderful long weekend.